Welcome back to the Force 13 studio, and it's been a little while since I last did one of these videos. And usually on our April predictions and in our end of May ones, I'm usually in the Force 13 garden, but we actually was washed out today and had some pea-sized hail earlier on in the evening as well. So here I am right now in the studio with the green screen behind me to show you all of what we're expecting from our April forecast on Force 13, looking across all of the Northern Hemisphere basins from the Atlantic through the Pacific to the North Indian Ocean. Quite a lot of variables coming into this season particularly. We've got this big promise of an El Nino that's on the way, and when we think of El Ninos we think of suppressed activity in the Atlantic and roaring activity across the Pacific, but I would like to caution you that it's probably not going to be as cut and dry as that. El Nino may only develop much later on in the season, and either way it looks like that the effects of it won't be felt properly until much later on. So there are still quite a lot of variables, but let's take a look first of all at the Atlantic numbers that we're now expecting. April forecasts, you know, sometimes they can be quite a bit out. They can change by the time we get to the end of May. That's one caveat we have to put down. It is still quite long range when we're looking towards the full season. Of course, the Atlantic hurricane season runs from June to November. But we are currently expecting 15 tropical storms, 8 hurricanes, and 3 majors for 2023. How exactly are those going to transpire? Well, let's take a look at the expected tracks and intensities. Well, not tracks and intensities, but significant hurricane tracks and some of our key messages. So we are expecting that quite a few different things are going to occur this year. I'll just read off this. Latest trends indicating conditions particularly favourable for hurricanes developing in the main development region and in the Western Atlantic this year. So we are expecting very favourable conditions, more than usual, over there in the main ocean regions, but not so much in the areas that are more affecting land, such as the Gulf. Northern Gulf looks like it might be better than usual this year, but the Caribbean we're expecting to be quite stifled for much of the year. Not to say that nothing will come out of it, but it does look like the Caribbean will be choking quite a bit. Interesting to note that what we're looking at right now, we're expecting very strong ridging over the North American continent this season, and that means much more chances of recurvatures, sharp recurvatures, thinking about storms that are moving up through the Greater Antilles or north of there, and then really starting to just sharply turn before reaching the US East Coast. Now, that's not a given that storms won't affect those areas. Indeed, I think we may have possibly several systems that go up through the central Gulf and through the Florida Peninsula this year, and then could of course go on to impact the East Coast. Indeed, some of those East Coast areas we are expecting to have the highest chances of tropical storm force winds. If you look at our other chart that we produced today, we are expecting in 1 or 2 counties 60% chances of tropical storm conditions this year, particularly near the Outer Banks and actually further north towards the Chesapeake Bay area, Delmarva Peninsula, and even a little bit beyond that. But in general, we are expecting a lot of recurvatures, not potentially not all of them, but certainly most of them. And some systems could develop quite a lot out over the main ocean region as well before recurving harmlessly. So Caribbean, I mentioned there, expected to remain calm overall, but developments in July and August near the Yucatan could produce hurricanes in the Gulf of Mexico, and of course who knows where they might go. Into the late season, conditions may become more favourable in the eastern Caribbean, affecting the Lesser Antilles, Puerto Rico and Hispaniola. So we're talking about October, maybe into November even. Potentially some systems that could be affecting those areas. Not quite wrong way Lenny in 1999, but certainly we could be looking at a system that might form in an area where Maria did in 2017 and move through some of those islands, hopefully nowhere near as strong. Having said that, Quite a few of the analogues that we're looking at this year do have strong storms in them, but then again there's quite a few as well that don't. So I would say that the chances of a really powerful storm this year, it's difficult to say, but it must be around average. In terms of distribution throughout the year, we're looking at pretty steady, to be honest, compared to average. Most of those months that we're looking at there are only just slightly above average. There's no months there that have an average of one storm above what we would usually expect. And just one other thing there that hasn't been mentioned. In my research on the climatological stuff, there wasn't much regarding Texas, but certainly what we're seeing from model consensus and suggestions so far is that we could see maybe a little bit more along the Texas coastline this year, around that Great Bend area and around the Mexican border region as well. Looks like that could be a hotspot potentially for at least one system to impact that area. I know it's been quite quiet there recently. So that's what we've really got to say about the Atlantic. Let's take a look at the Eastern Pacific now. In 2023, these are the numbers that we're expecting. We are expecting 16 tropical storms, 9 hurricanes, and 4 major hurricanes in 2023. Another interesting basin to predict, and as I said before, you would think that the El Nino effect, as it starts to take hold, will cause a lot of activity in the Eastern Pacific, but as far as we can tell, it looks like that the early part of this season and into the middle part even could be sedated quite a lot. And we're looking in August, for instance, well below average activity for that month. But we're expecting late on in the season that we might get a lot more activity, particularly towards the coast of Mexico, those breeding grounds that we usually see along that coast there, and sometimes you can see very strong storms in that late season period, so I'd be particularly cautious about that. Early season doesn't look like too much is going to happen, certainly strength-wise, but that may change, of course. But I would say June, July, we could see activity affecting the coast of Mexico. It does look like a lot of the tracks that we'll be seeing will be quite close to land. I'm not seeing much going well out to sea, and in fact I'm not even sure that any system is going to make it through to the Central Pacific from the eastern. I think there may be one perhaps, but it's going to be tough for them this year to make any real progress westward. Now that doesn't mean that we won't see activity homegrown, as it were, in the Central Pacific. I personally think that we will actually see our storm this year in the Central Pacific after 4 years without one, and possibly more than one. I think that we'll probably see something start to appear, maybe even the end of May, but June, July, I think we might see maybe a weak system just prowl across the Central Pacific there. We are giving the Hawaiian Islands, all of them, a 1 in 8 chance of receiving tropical storm conditions this year, so I guess that says something as well. Now, I would say the biggest chance for the Central Pacific would be a system that forms maybe south of Hawaii around October time. I would say that will be the best chance to see a Central Pacific system in 2023. Let me just check my notes here, make sure I didn't miss anything out. So activity likely to be generally suppressed, especially during August. Long tracking storms not likely. Late season signals are actually the strongest that we've seen in some time and could affect the entire coast of Mexico and possibly Guatemala as well along the coast right up through the Baja California Peninsula. So very strong signals for the late season this year, so I would certainly be on the lookout for that. And that's pretty much everything regarding the Eastern Pacific there. So let's take a look now at the Western Pacific, if I can find it. Here we go. This year, I know that in previous seasons we've been a little bit high on the numbers. Well, this might be an interesting one. This season we are predicting 24 tropical storms, 14 typhoons, and 7 major typhoons of Category 3 strength or higher. The Western Pacific is probably a tricky one to forecast this year, with quite a few anomalies on the climatological models. But take a look at the likely significant typhoon tracks in 2023 here. Most interesting to me from what I've seen so far is that we're not actually likely to see, we're likely to see more recurvatures than usual in the Western Pacific, and more substantial recurvatures as well. So this really puts, in my mind, we're talking about Taiwan, up the coast of China towards the Korean Peninsula for potential typhoon impacts, substantial ones. Philippines, of course, always has a typhoon risk. I think on average they get hit by 2 a year, so a full typhoon strength. So the Philippines always has that big chance of typhoon conditions. We're giving a 50% chance of a super typhoon, I think it was, impacting the Philippines. A major typhoon of category 3, and a 20% chance of a super typhoon impact this year. We're seeing very strong signals actually in August particularly, which is an interesting month in the Western Pacific. The peak of the season is on August 31st usually. So in August we're looking at big uptrends in activity for the Philippine Sea, out further towards the east as well. And this might be a theme throughout the whole season actually. We may see storms developing very far east compared to what we normally see, over the Micronesian Islands towards the Marshall Islands, and then potentially developing into strong typhoons as they approach the Philippine Islands, or recurve, as most of them should do during the course of this year. You can see some of those tracks there. Of course, there's going to be a lot more deviations on those very basic depictions. Just reading my notes here again. August and September are tipped to be the main months this season. Interestingly, we're looking at high pressure and dry air substantially stifling activity in October. In fact, I've hardly seen anything like it when looking at the long-range model projections, really suggesting an absolute shutdown of the basin throughout the whole of October, which normally in the Western Pacific is high season, and sometimes where we get the strongest typhoons. Of course, that could be wrong, and we're not going straight and putting our eggs in one basket with the model, but we're putting a little bit of faith into that, along with our climatological hints as well. But we are expecting only one storm to form in October as it stands right now. And in the late season, the Western Pacific will return a little bit, slightly more activity, and possibly late season activity as well, into December even, at lower latitudes, talking about the southern part of the Philippines towards the Gulf of Thailand, potentially some systems or one system there later on in the season. Storms likely to weaken substantially as they head northwards more than usual. We've seen that in some of our hints as well, what we've been researching, and even though Japan might be under the gun for significant impacts this year and several tropical cyclones, I somewhat doubt that they'll see a strong typhoon landfall this year, but I think they will get hit with several tropical storms. As for Korea, that's a 50-50 shot. In normal occasions, it's quite difficult to predict what happens along the Korean Peninsula. Sometimes a strong typhoon can go right up there through the East China Sea and impact there at a very high strength, or they can go via China and be just a weak tropical storm by the time they run through the Korean Peninsula, usually turning post-tropical as they do so. But that's what we're expecting for the Western Pacific right now, and we don't have a map for the Indian Ocean, but we just have some numbers for you. Oh, we do have a map, pardon me, but just to tell you those numbers right now, we are expecting in the Indian Ocean this season 4 tropical storms, 1 Category 1 equivalent, and 0 Category 3 equivalent storms. Now, of course, we can never rule out a very strong storm occurring in the Indian Ocean, but certainly looking at the research and climatological analogues, it seems very unlikely. The best years in comparison with this for analogues right now are 2009 and 1973 for the North Indian Ocean, and neither of those seasons contained a single hurricane strength storm. So we are actually going a little bit high there with the 1, but I think the way things are, I think we might do. Enhanced precipitation and possibly cyclonic activity expected in the eastern Bay of Bengal along the coast of Myanmar, particularly in the early part of this season. We're talking May and June. Certainly we're looking on the climatological models, very enhanced precipitation, and so that could be as a result of a tropical cyclone or two. That can happen in the early season, of course. A very, very famous example in 2008, Cyclone Nargis, nearly up to 15 years now since that storm occurred, was a very devastating storm, but I think we could see, a storm or two in that region. Bay of Bengal itself, though, towards the Indian coastline, we're not really seeing any strong signals, to be honest. Maybe a weak system or two in the end of May, June, but overall during the season we're not seeing very strong signals. Like the Western Pacific, we think it's going to shut down completely in October, although the Arabian Sea is a little bit different. It starts to liven up a little bit by the looks of things in October, November, and I think we could see one or more tropical cyclones forming and moving through that channel, much like, if you remember, that we saw in 2015, of course, those two strong storms in that area towards the Arabian Peninsula. I don't think they'll be as crazy as that, but I think we will see some systems that could go on to threaten the coast of Oman. So 4 cyclones there, activity expected very suppressed, like I said there. Could pick up again though in November and even in December in the Bay of Bengal. We could see a very backloaded season in both the North Indian and Western Pacific, right at the very end, squeezing in a few cyclones in the last 2 months of the year. So usually our streams are a little bit more comprehensive than that on our April predictions, but to be honest, we haven't really had much time to get everything ready. But we've done quite a bit of research at this point, and no doubt we'll be doing tons more before our main forecast comes out at the end of May. That's the one we always pin ourselves to, really, the big one that we do, and that will be during our countdown to Atlantic hurricane season, of course, at the end of May, May 31st. That's when we release our full prediction. But hopefully this has shown you a decent view on what we think is going to happen this season coming up. In the Southern Hemisphere, we've had certainly an interesting turn of events. Of course, Cyclone Freddy earlier on, if you missed it, in March and February, lasted extremely long. I think it was something like 34 days or 37 days, I don't even remember anymore, but it became the longest lived tropical cyclone on record as it moved through the entire Indian Ocean, and that was one of the main features that we had this year so far. Of course, there's a cyclone impending near the coast of Australia right now as well, so it looks like the late season in the Southern Hemisphere is giving us a few things to talk about as well. In the meantime, not much left for me to say here. Hope it's been a useful prediction, and I'm sure we'll have many discussions on this as time goes on. Take a look at the Force 13 website. We have new satellite tracking pages where we have floaters and radar floaters as well, so lots of nice ways to track the tropics now on our website. I've been waiting years for it. Our technicians in the background have been supreme. I'm talking about Jason particularly, who's been with us for many years, and eventually we'll be doing more automated streaming as well. Of course, there's one active right now, currently tracking that cyclone near the coast of Australia. But that's it from Force 13 HQ. We hope to see you again soon, and we'll be here all year long tracking all of these storms as they occur around the world. Keep it here.